She looked at me with a quiet smile and said, "This will be our secret forever." I didn't know then that some secrets don't fade. They live inside you, waiting to be remembered. It began on one of those evenings that feel like they're holding their breath, where the city slows down just enough for you to notice the colors bleeding out of the sunset. The kind of evening that doesn't promise anything, but leaves room for something unexpected. I hadn't planned to stay long at the art exhibit. A friend had invited me, insisting it would be good for me, whatever that meant. I remember standing near the entrance, pretending to admire a painting while quietly calculating how soon I could slip out without seeming rude. The room hummed with low chatter, clinking glasses, and the faint echo of a jazz record spinning somewhere in the background. Then I saw her. She stood by the far wall, where the light was softer, studying a painting of a lake at dusk. The brushstrokes glimmered faintly under the gallery lamps, but her stillness made the whole scene look alive. She had that quiet kind of confidence, the kind that doesn't ask for attention but naturally receives it. Long black hair framed her face, and there was something in her expression, some blend of grace and melancholy, that drew me in before I realized it. I don't know what made me walk over. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the way the world seemed to fade around her. When I spoke, my voice came out lower than I intended. "Beautiful piece, isn't it?" She turned toward me, and for a moment, the space between us seemed to tighten. Her eyes, dark, calm, aware, met mine with the kind of steadiness that made me forget what I just said. "It is," she replied softly. "It feels like it's holding something back, like the painter stopped before saying everything." Her words landed somewhere deep, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Slowly, intentionally, like everything deserved its own breath. We talked a little more about art, about how quiet places often say the most. She mentioned she used to paint, but her tone carried the weight of a story she wasn't ready to tell. I didn't press. There was a gentle caution in her. Not walls, exactly, but quiet thresholds she wasn't sure anyone should cross. When someone called her name across the room, she gave a small, polite smile and said, "It was nice meeting you." Then she turned and walked away, her silhouette slipping into the soft gold light near the exit. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the empty space she left behind. I couldn't explain it, but her absence filled the room more completely than her presence had. On my way out, I passed the same painting, the lake at dusk, and for the first time, I noticed something I hadn't before, a faint reflection of two figures in the water, standing close but not touching. I don't know if that detail had been there all along, but as I stepped into the night air, I knew one thing. That brief exchange had changed the way I looked at stillness, and somehow, it already felt like the beginning of a secret neither of us had spoken aloud. 2 days later, the rain hadn't stopped, the kind that doesn't pour or threaten, just lingers, soft and rhythmic, tapping against windows like it's thinking of something it can't quite say. I told myself I only went to the cafe for the coffee. But that wasn't true. There she was again. Same black hair, tied loosely this time, strands falling over one shoulder. Same stillness, the kind that made her seem untouched by the rush of people around her. She was sitting by the window, sketchbook open in front of her, but she wasn't drawing. She was staring outside, watching the city blur through the rain. I hesitated before approaching. Something about her presence made the world feel slower, quieter. It was as if even time gave her space. When she finally noticed me, a flicker of surprise crossed her face, then softened into a faint, knowing smile. "You again?" she said, voice low but colored with amusement. "Guess I have good timing," I replied. She gestured toward the chair across from her. "It's still empty." So I sat down. For a while, neither of us spoke. The rain filled the silence better than words could. Steam curled from our cups. Somewhere in the distance, a jazz tune floated from the cafe speakers, slow, nostalgic, familiar. When she finally spoke, her tone was lighter than it had been at the gallery. "You come here often?" "Sometimes, when I need to think." She smiled at that, eyes glancing toward the window again. "Seems like a good place for it." Thinking. The way she said thinking, almost like she understood the kind of thoughts that didn't want to be shared, made my chest tighten slightly. There was no flirtation in her words, not really. Just understanding. But somehow, that felt more dangerous. We talked about small things, books we loved, music we didn't, the way rain makes cities look honest. She told me she'd once taught art at a small college before stopping suddenly, though she didn't say why. I didn't ask. There was something sacred about not asking. At one point, she laughed, really laughed, when I admitted how I tried painting once and ended up with something that looked like a crime scene made of colors. The sound of her laughter filled the quiet cafe in a way that made my skin warm. As the hours passed, the light outside shifted from silver to gold. The rain slowed. People came and went, but we stayed. The world around us thinned until it felt like there were only two people in it. When she finally glanced at the clock, her eyebrows lifted slightly. "You've been here for hours. Feels like minutes," I said. She tilted her head, smiling just enough for her eyes to crinkle. "You're young. Time behaves differently for you." "Maybe," I said, meeting her gaze. "But right now, I think it's behaving just fine." For a moment, she didn't look away. There was something in her eyes then, not sadness, not longing, but recognition. The quiet understanding that something had just begun, even if neither of us was ready to name it. When I finally stood to leave, she closed her sketchbook slowly and said, almost teasingly, "Let's keep this ours, okay? No one needs to know." I smiled. "Our secret, then?" She held my gaze for half a second longer than necessary. "Forever," she said, and somehow, it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a promise. It started as coincidence, then slowly turned into something else. Every few days, I'd find myself at the cafe again, pretending it was just habit, but it wasn't. I was waiting for her, though I never said it out loud, not even to myself. And more often than not, she was there. Always at the same table by the window, always with that same quiet poise. A cup of tea beside her, a sketchbook open though she rarely drew in it. Sometimes she read, sometimes she just watched the street like it was telling her something no one else could hear. Those afternoons began to feel like stolen time. Little fragments of the world that didn't belong to anyone else. We never arranged to meet. We just seemed to find each other there, like the universe was humoring us. We talked about everything and nothing. She'd tell me stories from years ago, about people who had come and gone, about her younger self who was braver, more impulsive. Sometimes she'd laugh at her own stories, shaking her head as if surprised by how long ago it all felt. I listened, memorizing her voice, her small gestures, the way she'd tap her cup when thinking, the faint crease between her eyebrows when she grew serious. There was a patience in her, a deliberate calmness that made me slow down without even realizing it. Sometimes, when she leaned forward to make a point, her hand would rest on mine for a heartbeat too long. Not deliberate, but not accidental either. Just long enough for me to feel the warmth of her skin, the pulse beneath it, and the quiet understanding that both of us were pretending it meant nothing. One evening, after the cafe had nearly emptied, she told me about a painting she never finished. "I stopped halfway through," she said softly, staring at the rim of her cup. "Not because I couldn't, but because I was afraid of ruining it. Some things feel perfect until you try to complete them." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. But later, walking home through the drizzle, I realized she wasn't really talking about art. As the weeks passed, our moments began to stretch. A walk after coffee, a shared umbrella when it rained. The silence between us grew heavier, not in discomfort, but in meaning. Every glance, every pause, every unspoken word seemed to hum with something unnameable. We never called it anything. Didn't need to. Some things were better left unspoken. One night, as we stood outside the cafe, the street quiet and wet with rain, she looked at me, really looked, and said, almost under her breath, "It feels like a secret, doesn't it?" I met her gaze, my voice barely more than a whisper. "It is a secret." She smiled then, a small, wistful curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "Then let's keep it that way." She turned to leave, her reflection gliding along the rain-dappled windows, and for the first time, I realized that secrets don't always need to be spoken. Sometimes they're just lived, moment by moment, heartbeat by heartbeat. And in that quiet space between what was allowed and what was felt, our story kept breathing quietly, invisibly, like something too fragile for the world to see. There's a moment in every story like this where the line between what you want and what you should do begins to blur. For us, it happened quietly, not in some grand confession or dramatic kiss, but in the stillness that came after laughter. We were sitting at her place that evening, a small apartment filled with warm light, books, and the faint smell of paint. She had invited me in after a long walk. The rain had started again, and it felt natural, almost necessary, to stay a little longer. She handed me a towel, smiling softly as I ran it through my hair. "You'll catch a cold," she said, her tone gentle, familiar, like someone who'd said that 100 times before and never stopped meaning it. I sat on the couch while she poured tea. She moved with a kind of grace that came from habit, the calm rhythm of someone who had learned to live alone and fill the silence herself. Watching her then, I realized how much I'd missed just being seen like this. Not as someone trying to prove something, but simply as someone there. We talked for hours again, drifting from books to art to the strange ache of growing older too soon or too late. She told me about her students, about how she missed teaching but not the noise of it, and I told her how I felt lost sometimes, like the world expected me to have already chosen who I was supposed to be. At one point, our conversation faded into quiet. She was sitting close now, the air between us heavy but not uncomfortable. The lamp light caught the edges of her face, the faint laugh lines, the glint in her eyes, the calmness she carried like armor. I remember her fingers brushing against mine, light, uncertain. Neither of us moved away. It was such a small thing, and yet it felt enormous. My heart was too loud, the silence too fragile. Then she looked at me, really looked, and for a moment, the room seemed to still around us. There was no pretending anymore. Whatever this was, it had grown roots. "You know this can't," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I said before she could finish. Her eyes softened then, but there was sadness in them too, the kind that comes from understanding the cost of something beautiful. She exhaled slowly, and for a moment, I thought she'd pull away. Instead, she rested her head lightly against my shoulder. We stayed that way. No words, no promises. Just the quiet rhythm of rain outside, the warmth of her against me, and the heavy truth hanging unspoken between us. It wasn't wrong. It wasn't right. It just was. And maybe that's what made it feel so impossible. The fact that something so simple could feel like both a gift and a danger at the same time. When I finally stood to leave, she didn't stop me. She just said softly, almost to herself, "Some lines aren't meant to be crossed." I paused at the door and turned back to her. "Then why does it feel like we already have?" She didn't answer, just looked down, her lips curved into that same quiet, knowing smile. And in that silence, I realized sometimes the line isn't crossed in action, but in the wanting. It happened on one of those nights that felt almost too still, where the air carries a kind of quiet that makes every sound feel louder than it should. I hadn't planned on seeing her again that evening. I was walking home from work, hands buried in my jacket pockets, when I passed the cafe where we'd first met. And there she was, sitting by the window, her hair pulled back loosely, her eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the glass. The sight of her stopped me in my tracks. It had been days since I'd seen her last, days that felt longer than they should have. Something in me hesitated, but something stronger made me open the door. She looked up as the bell chimed, and for a second, her face softened. "You always show up when it rains," she said with a half-smile. "It's my excuse to stay a little longer," I said quietly. We sat again at that same corner table. The world outside was blurred by streaks of water, the reflections of streetlights dancing across the glass. There was comfort in it, a sense of returning, of slipping into something familiar, even if it wasn't safe. We talked like we always did, about nothing and everything. But there was something different in the way she looked at me tonight. Her laughter was softer, her words slower, like each one was weighed before it left her lips. At one point, the conversation stopped altogether. She leaned her chin on her hand, eyes tracing my face as though she were memorizing something she shouldn't. The silence wasn't awkward. It was thick, charge alive. When the cafe announced its closing, neither of us moved. She glanced at the door, then at me. "Walk me home," she asked. The streets glowed under the pale orange of the lamps. The rain had lightened into a mist that clung to our clothes and hair. We didn't speak much. There wasn't anything left to say. The air between us carried everything that words couldn't hold. When we reached her building, she stopped at the steps, turned, and smiled faintly. "You'll catch a cold again," she murmured. "Then maybe you should invite me in," I said before I could think twice. She hesitated. That long, trembling pause where choice and consequence meet. Then, without a word, she unlocked the door. Inside, her apartment felt warmer than I remembered. The faint scent of paint and jasmine filled the air. She took off her coat, hung it neatly, and motioned for me to sit. Neither of us spoke. She walked over, stood beside the couch, and looked at me, a look that held both tenderness and fear. Her hand lifted slowly, brushing a damp strand of hair from my forehead. The touch was light, almost unsure, but it lingered just a moment too long. "I shouldn't," she whispered. "I know," I replied. For a second, the whole world seemed to narrow to that single heartbeat, her breath against my skin, my pulse racing beneath it. And then she stepped back, closing her eyes as if steadying herself. "This stays between us," she said softly. "Our secret forever." The words hung there, fragile and final. Outside, the rain picked up again, tapping gently against the window. Inside, everything had changed, not because of what happened, but because of what almost did. We both knew the line had blurred completely now, and there would be no going back. The days that followed felt both ordinary and completely different, like life had quietly shifted on its axis and no one but us had noticed. I saw her less often, but when I did, everything carried that unspoken weight. A glance that lingered too long, a silence that said too much. We didn't talk about that night. Not once. It was as if saying it out loud would make it real, expose it to the light, and we both knew the light could be cruel. Instead, we went back to our rhythms, the small cafe meetings, long walks by the river, the late-night talks about nothing in particular. But beneath it all, there was a pulse, something we were both pretending not to feel anymore, though it lived in every shared look and every brush of her hand against mine. One afternoon, we met at the art gallery. It was quiet. Only a few people wandering the halls, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. She was standing in front of a painting, her profile outlined by the soft glow of afternoon light streaming through tall windows. When I approached, she smiled, that kind of smile that's gentle but doesn't quite reach the eyes. "It's beautiful," I said, nodding at the painting. She tilted her head. "It's complicated. That's what makes it real." We stood there for a while, side by side, our shoulders almost touching. The scent of her perfume, something subtle, like jasmine and rain, filled the space between us. I could feel the warmth of her arm, the soft rhythm of her breathing. "Do you ever regret things that made sense only in the moment?" I asked quietly. She turned to look at me then, eyes deep, searching, filled with something that looked like sadness and understanding all at once. "All the time," she said, "but some moments they're meant to stay untouched. You don't fix them. You just keep them where they belong." Her voice trembled slightly, and for a second, I wanted to reach for her hand. But I didn't. Not there. Not with people around us. Not with her fighting to keep control. When we left, she walked beside me in silence. The wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the pavement. I caught her shivering lightly, and without thinking, I offered her my jacket. She hesitated, then accepted it with a quiet "thank you." Her fingers brushed mine as she took it, and that single touch was enough to bring everything back. The rain, the warmth, the words we'd promised to keep hidden. Back at her building, she stopped by the door. For the first time, she didn't invite me in. She just looked up at me and said, "We have to be careful. Not for others, for us." I nodded, though part of me hated how reasonable it sounded. "I don't want to lose this," I said. "You won't," she whispered. "You'll just learn to carry it differently." Her voice broke slightly on the last word. She smiled, small, brave, and disappeared inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. Her words echoed over and over, carry it differently. And that's when I realized what we had wasn't fading. It was changing form, from something we shared out loud to something we'd keep in the quiet parts of ourselves. A secret, yes, but one that had become part of who we were. Time has a strange way of softening even the sharpest moments, not erasing them, just blurring their edges until they live quietly in the corners of your mind. Months passed, and though life moved forward for both of us, a part of me still lingered in that soft, rain-drenched space we once shared. I saw her less often, sometimes by accident, a glimpse of her across a bookstore or walking along the same street where the cafe still stood. Each time, there was that flicker of recognition, small, cautious, and warm, like two people who shared a story no one else would ever understand. The cafe itself had changed. New owners, new paint, even new music. But when I sat by that window again one late afternoon, it still felt like her presence lingered there. The way she used to sit, the quiet way she stirred her tea before speaking, the softness of her laugh when something caught her off guard. It was all still here, invisible but deeply felt. I didn't expect to see her that day, but life seems to know when to send its quiet reminders. She walked in, her hair slightly shorter, her smile the same. The sight of her pulled the air right out of my chest. "Didn't think I'd find you here again," she said gently, her voice still carrying that calm steadiness I'd missed. "I could say the same to you," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. She sat across from me, just like before. We didn't rush into conversation. We never had to. Some connections don't need to be rebuilt. They simply resume, like a book you were meant to keep reading. We talked about how life had been, how she'd started teaching again, how I'd finally begun writing the stories I used to only talk about. Every sentence felt like a quiet exchange of memories, each word bridging the distance that time had built between us. At one point, she reached across the table, not to take my hand, but to brush away a crumb near my wrist. Her fingers lingered for the briefest second, and that was enough to remind me how much meaning could live inside a single touch. "It feels like a lifetime ago," I said. She smiled softly. "It was a different time, but it was real." I nodded. "And the secret?" Her eyes lifted to meet mine, calm and certain. "Still ours." Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting golden light through the cafe windows. The dust in the air shimmered, suspended, like the moment itself refused to end. We didn't make promises this time. There were no confessions, no apologies. Just a shared quiet, deep and peaceful, where everything unsaid finally felt understood. When she stood to leave, she rested a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Take care of yourself," she said softly, "and keep the secret safe." I watched her walk away, the same steady, graceful stride, fading into the brightness of the street. And I realized then that she wasn't a chapter one needed to close. She was the underline, the part that made everything before and after make sense. Some love stories don't need endings. They just need to be remembered. And so I did. Her voice, her warmth, her promise, all kept, just as she said. Our secret, forever.